Okay, so in the 13 years that I've been running this YouTube channel and teaching people about comics, the one thing I miss the most is actually teaching people about comics. I feel like we've just been covering stories recently. So I want to teach you guys about Franklin Richards, because while we have made a lot of videos about his character over the years, when you consolidate all that information and you lay it all flat and look at it as one giant, puzzle board, you really start to realize how powerful Franklin Richards is. So, when it comes to Franklin's powers, there's like three main explanations for how he has his abilities in Marvel Comics. And his original appearance in Fantastic Four Annual number 6, this was given to us as a byproduct of something called the Cosmic Control Rod. And the Cosmic Control Rod is kind of the negative zone's equivalent to the Power Cosmic. Most of you guys know the Power Cosmic is the source of Galactus' power. The negative zone is basically like this one particular universe that every other universe across the multiverse can access, and that inside the negative zone, you have Annihilus, right? This being that just kind of rules the place with an iron fist. He uses the Cosmic Control Rod to slow his aging, but to also grant him the ability to manipulate all forms of matter. And so when Susan Storm was pregnant with Franklin, the initial explanation for Franklin's powers, if we want to call it that, really came in a very limited way, which is to say he was basically sucking on the life force of Susan Storm. Instead of just taking the nutrients from the food that she consumes, he was literally consuming her life energies. And so Reed Richards and the other members of the Fantastic Four travel to the negative zone. They attain the Cosmic Control Rod, they bring it back. Reed uses it to stabilize the energies in Susan's body, and then she gives birth to a healthy baby. And so for years in Marvel Comics, Franklin had just derived his powers from the Cosmic Control Rod's energies that were used by Reed to stabilize the birthing process. Now, not too long after that, Marvel started introducing the idea of Franklin being a mutant. And the reason why I don't really cite a particular issue for why this was the case is because, number one, this is just kind of the current standing of Franklin, that he is a mutant in Marvel Comics. And number two, because it's so well known and Marvel bounces back and forth so consistently, it's kind of hard to pin down exactly when the first issue was where Marvel referenced Franklin Richards being a mutant. But what's important here is this. The third explanation for the source of Franklin's powers, and maybe not really the source, but just the full totality of what he can do, is that he draws on the energies of the nexus of all realities. Now, I'll talk about that here in a second, because we're actually going to circle back to that here in a little bit. But in essence, Franklin's drawing on the energies of the multiverse. Now, that explanation didn't last very long. It really hasn't been explored since. But to give you guys this kind of display of what Franklin can do, I mean, it's nuts. But what's kind of cool about this is that it starts off with what are essentially small little moments, and then almost kind of crescendos into like just these crazy displays of powers. Then it like flattens out, and then you go into Hickman's run when he really just kind of picks up steam on what Franklin can do. So the early displays of Franklin's powers were little things like controlling ants, right? How ants move around and different things like that. In Fantastic Four 130, that he actually kind of sends a alert to Ben Grimm, the Thing, that the Fantastic Four are being attacked by the Frightful Four. It's a subconscious act, but it's kind of the idea that Franklin is always aware of what's going on around him. In Fantastic Four number 140, that's actually a story where Annihilus had invaded the main Marvel universe, and then taking Franklin Richards had hooked him up to a machine that actually activated all of Franklin's latent abilities at one time. Now, because of the limited nature of how powers were displayed at Marvel at this point in time, it wasn't anything crazy. If anything, it was just kind of this idea, at least from Reed's perspective, that Franklin being unable to control his abilities would wipe out all life on Earth. And so this is the storyline that some of you guys may have heard about, where Reed Richards actually puts Franklin in a coma in order to ensure that Franklin's powers don't manifest and he doesn't destroy everything in existence. Now, all that was undone about 10 issues later in Avengers issue 127 and Fantastic Four number 150. This is a story where Ultron launches an attack. Technically, it's Ultron 7, the 7th version of the Ultron robot, and that it wakes up Franklin Richards, who literally just blasts Ultron with all this power, the full totality of Franklin's power, and while it's enough to defeat Ultron, it was almost like Franklin just letting off steam, that it was kind of a one-off. And what this did is it allowed Marvel to reset his powers, quote-unquote, back to normal. And that goes in to Fantastic Four 245, which is a story that we've covered and a story that a lot of people are familiar with, which is where Franklin Richards ages himself into an adult. Now, one of the important things about this story is that it's one of the very first times in Marvel that we see Franklin Richards Richards manipulating matter and energy in a traditional sense, which is to say, when it comes to people manipulating energy and magic, reality warping, things like that, it's like turning something into something else, or taking someone's powers away, or something along those lines. Up until this point, it had just been huge amounts of energy being blasted by Franklin, or something along those lines. The idea behind this story is that coming off the heels of Fantastic Four 244, which is a story that involved Galactus and the Thing one-shotting Galactus, which was kind of nuts, the trial of Reed Richards story specifically, that what this did is it had this instance where Ben Grimm was playing with a Rubik's Cube, and then he just tosses it to Franklin. And while Franklin's playing with this Rubik's Cube, Leave It to Beaver is playing in the background. And there's this statement that's made on the TV, when are you going to grow up? And Franklin subconsciously ages himself into an adult. Now, this is also an instance where it built on what had already been established in Marvel, which is that one, Franklin normally uses his powers subconsciously at this young age, and two, it's usually tied into his emotional state. And at the time that he was playing with the Rubik's Cube, he was frustrated. Now, the way the story played out was that Franklin Richards, being an adult, didn't quite understand what was going on. That as far as he was concerned by his physical appearance, he was a fully adult male and kind of looked like a blonde Jesus. But in being an adult, a lot of time should have passed from when he was a child, but there were no memories of that time. And so when he was attacking the members of the Fantastic Four, he kept talking about how something's missing. There's a hole. He doesn't understand what's happening. Eventually, it all comes to a head when Susan Storm realizes it's Franklin. Nobody else knew. And in fact, Franklin was simply just missing. So the belief was that because there had been so many attacks on the Baxter building, that villains had somehow come after Franklin or something along those lines. But when Susan puts two and two together, it brings Franklin kind of back to reality. And Franklin realizes what it was that he had done. This was also a very important moment for Reed, because what he realized was that because Franklin is so powerful, and because Franklin has the ability to alter himself, has the ability to affect and overpower various individuals that exist out there, that he's not simply just a credible threat to the superhero community or Earth, that he would actually be a credible threat to the universe as a whole. And so this is the story where Reed Richards put mental blocks in Franklin Richards' mind to keep him from using his powers, or at least only small amounts of his powers. And so because of this, going into Fantastic Four, issue number 277, this is also another iconic moment for Franklin. And it really kind of showed the idea that the mental blocks were not necessarily a permanent thing. Because in this story, in issue 277 anyway, that's when Franklin Richards overpowers and destroys Mephisto in Marvel Comics. Now, this story was particularly important, not just because of Franklin's ability to destroy Mephisto and the sheer level of power that he had being put on full display, but because this was the story that actually affected Scarlet Witch. That shortly after the destruction of Mephisto, Scarlet Witch and Vision had a couple of kids. And then once the shards of Mephisto, the pieces of him, were restored, two of which included Billy and Tommy, those kids of Wanda and Vision disappeared. And that led to Wanda believing they had been taken or kidnapped or something like that. They had been destroyed. And so ultimately those memories were wiped from her mind. That story comes to a head in Avengers Disassembled. That's where Wanda seemingly just kind of remembers that she had kids at some point and believes the Avengers are holding them away from her or something along those lines. But that's how you get into the story of Wanda in Marvel Comics. Now, again, we're not really talking about Wanda per se, so we're not going to go off on that bit of a diatribe here. But that takes us into Fantastic Four 282 and Power Pack. And this actually introduced another aspect to Franklin's powers that had kind of been teased previously, but never fully explored in any meaningful way. And that was Franklin Richards' ability to see the future. Now, the way it was originally done is that Franklin would get these glimpses, these dreams. So even he wouldn't necessarily know if it was an absolute truth. But more than simply the ability to see the future, it was also Franklin being aware of what was happening across the universe at any particular point in time. So in addition to being able to see the future, clairvoyance essentially, Franklin also demonstrated cosmic awareness. And so the entire basis behind the Power Pack story, as awesome as it was, is that Franklin would have these prophetic dreams of things that were happening or going to happen, and then Power Pack would respond, right? So it was a cool little way to kind of give him his adventure, and he actually went by the name Tattletale. Power Pack was great. It was incredibly fun back in the day. But that takes us into the 1990s, and I hope you guys are starting to see this crescendo, right, of Franklin demonstrating greater and greater abilities in Marvel Comics. In the Onslaught saga in the mid-1990s, this is when you had seen really the greatest display of Franklin's powers up to that point in time. And for those of you guys who are not familiar with Onslaught, I know a lot of you guys know of him. A lot of people were excited about his character. I think in, was it X-Men 97 season 2 or season 3, I think was the kicker that Marvel was going to come out with. That Onslaught was a kind of combination of Xavier's frustration with humanity mixing with Magneto's hatred of humanity. And it created this psychic entity. And Onslaught went on a rampage across the entirety of the Marvel universe, overpowering pretty much everybody. But what Onslaught would do is whenever he came across individuals of particular levels of power that were very unique and extreme in varying ways, Onslaught would essentially absorb them, collect them, and then he would draw on those powers to achieve a goal. But the kicker to this is that those individuals would have to kind of let Onslaught use their abilities. And so what had happened over the course of the story is that Onslaught had discovered Franklin Richards and absorbed Franklin Richards. And what Onslaught would do is he would kind of manifest this psychic version of itself as a young person to talk to Franklin and get Franklin to open up and get Franklin to allow Onslaught to use his abilities and so on and so forth. Now, such as it was, there came a point in the story where Apocalypse and Susan Storm rescued Franklin. Now, it's not really a true rescue mission, as it may seem. The entire intention behind Apocalypse was to actually take Franklin and use Franklin as his new vessel for his powers, so that Apocalypse would have greater powers than he'd ever had before by harnessing the abilities of Franklin. And Susan Storm, realizing that Apocalypse would be up to no good, made herself invisible, followed him when he essentially entered into Onslaught. And then when Apocalypse made his move, Susan Storm intervened. And then alongside X-Man Nate Gray, they rescued Franklin Richards. But the fact is, right, that the reason why Onslaught is so important when it comes to Franklin's powers is not because of the absorption process and the attempt of Onslaught to use Franklin's powers to rewrite reality. It's because of what Franklin did afterwards. The reason being because the superhero started to realize that the only way to destroy Onslaught as a being of psychic energy was to literally jump into him, right? To kind of destroy him from the inside out, so to speak. Now, on a publishing side, it was Marvel basically realizing no one but the X-Men and Spider-Man are popular. So it was a quote-unquote reboot. And so what ended up happening is essentially every superhero in Marvel outside of Spider-Man and the X-Men jumped into Onslaught, and they all, quote-unquote, died. The reason why this is important to Franklin is because what Franklin had done was subconsciously resurrected all of them from the dead, and then put them in this little pocket dimension called the Heroes Reborn universe. And it came in the form of a little blue ball that he carried with him everywhere he went. So for those of you guys who have gone down this kind of rabbit hole, right, in your journey of learning about Franklin Richards, you've undoubtedly come across the iconic picture where he's just kind of sitting there with a ball under his arm. That was Heroes Reborn. And all those various superheroes were getting like new origin stories and all that kind of stuff in that whole thing. Now, of course, this also went into a story called Daydreamers, and this gives us a chance to wrap back around to what we were talking about before. Daydreamers was Marvel's attempt to build on what had been established in Heroes Reborn, and essentially saying that Franklin is vastly more powerful than any of us had ever been led to believe. That what Franklin Richards was doing was drawing on the nexus of realities. And so what I want to do here for a quick second is I want to sidestep Franklin, and I want to talk about the nature of the multiverse, right? Because in Marvel Comics, you can access the multiverse in a variety of different ways, right? If you're someone like the Fantastic Four, you can basically create a portal that takes you to the negative zone. And then from the negative zone, you can go into any universe across the entirety of the multiverse. People like Doctor Strange can transition using magic, although he's not really supposed to and rarely ever does. Someone like the Marquis of Death, right? Arguably the most powerful mutant to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics, simply has that inherent ability because his powers are so incredibly extreme. But then there are other methods of accessing the multiverse. The M'Kraan Crystal, for example, a kind of hallway of doors for the multiverse where the Phoenix Force resides. Jean Grey is able to access that. And in fact, in the story Here Comes Tomorrow, she communicated with all these different versions of the Phoenix from across the multiverse. But when it comes to the nexus of realities, As crazy as it sounds, it exists in the Florida Everglades. And it's guarded by Man-Thing, right? Those who know fear burn at the touch of the Man-Thing. You guys have heard that phrase before. That if you can successfully pass the Man-Thing and enter into the nexus of realities, you'll be met with this almost kind of like crazy roller coaster, loop-de-loop type of thing with all these paths that go all over the place. And they all lead to different universes and so on and so forth. The reason why this applied to Franklin is because during Daydreamers, Franklin Richards teamed up with Man-Thing and with Tana Nile and Howard the Duck and a few other people, and they were traveling across these different realities. And they started to realize that what Franklin had been doing was subconsciously creating these realities. Now, again, it didn't last very long, right? Marvel really didn't do a whole lot with this. And a lot of this is simply because this revelation had elevated Franklin to such a level of power that the question was, how do you tell stories with this guy? Right? I mean, this person has the ability to create alternate realities. Well, you kind of have to run with it, right? And so if you have someone with that level of power, then any fight that the Fantastic Four would find themselves involved in, if Franklin Richards was there, is a non-starter, right? He snaps his fingers, the fight's over, and it's hard to tell any story like that. So that was undone pretty quickly in Marvel. With the idea of Heroes Reborn, for example, right? Franklin Richards ended up coming across Ashama, I think her name was, one of the Celestials. And she basically told him that you cannot have an instance of two realities occupying the same space at the same time. One of these realities has to be undone. It has to go away. And so what ended up happening is Franklin Richards struck a kind of a compromise. That what he did is he pulled all the different superheroes from the Heroes Reborn pocket universe that he had made and then brought them back to the main Marvel universe. And that pocket Earth that he had created actually ended up becoming Counter Earth, which was on the other side of the sun and existed for a while, and seemingly Marvel's forgotten about it. I don't recall if it's been destroyed. I don't have an answer to that question. But the bigger thing is this, right? Following all of this stuff, that's when you really go into Hickman's run. And the reason why Hickman's run, when it came to Franklin Richards, was so incredibly important is because while it was technically a Fantastic Four run, the story was the story of Franklin. It was a story of a father and a son, right? It was the effects of Reed Richards having felt abandoned by his father, and it kind of explained why Reed Richards wasn't the best family man, because he never really grew up in a family of his own. And so the idea of Franklin's involvement here initially started with Dark Reign. And it was one of these really, really cool little moments, right? It was really Jonathan Hickman just kind of taking everything that made Franklin awesome over the years in Marvel and consolidating it all down. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Dark Reign, and I know we've talked about doing it and we will cover it, but Dark Reign was the story that came in the aftermath of Secret Invasion. When Deadpool was sending information to Nick Fury on how to defeat the Skrull invasion, it was intercepted by Norman Osborn, and Norman Osborn ended the war. Tony Stark was blamed by the government for not being able to see that Secret Invasion was happening. He was fired right from the position of Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Norman Osborn was put in his place. And as we've said so many times, when a bad guy is put in a position of power, he does what bad guys do. And so when Norman Osborn disbanded S.H.I.E.L.D., he created Hammer, yada, yada, yada. One of the first things he did was invade the Baxter Building with the intention of seizing control of it and taking all the technology in it. Now, while that does lead into some kind of grandiose story in and of itself, largely when it came to Franklin, the first real display of Hickman telling us Franklin's reality warping powers are beginning to emerge is when he fired real bullets from a fake gun. And that was nuts. It was kind of crazy when it happened. And not even Franklin had realized what he had done. And so following that, on Franklin's birthday, right, the comic that focused on that particular event, a mystery man appeared out of nowhere. And that guy basically grabbed Franklin and then just kind of did something to him, right? And then Franklin passes out. Now, there is a whole plot that comes out of that as well, right? This guy talking to Franklin's sister Valeria and warning her about the War of the Four Cities and all that kind of stuff. That stuff we don't necessarily have to get into. Keeping the focus on Franklin here, that guy was Franklin from the future, right? It was his future self. And what he had done is he had completely unleashed the powers of Franklin Richards when he was a little kid in the present day. And so present Franklin, literally one of the things you see is him sitting in his bedroom, creating a whole universe under his blanket. And again, that was really Hickman saying, this kid can essentially do anything now. So what will he do? And so what followed over the course of that is really a series of kind of backup features in the Fantastic Four comics. Is it was this mystery man that Franklin Richards in the present had met, not knowing it was his future self, that future Franklin was teaching his younger version how to use his powers, how to harness his powers. And in fact, they did all kinds of crazy stuff. They were creating alternate realities They were literally filling those realities with life, stars, planets, galaxies, solar systems, the whole nine yards. It was really Jonathan Hickman saying, there's no real limit to what Franklin can do. And this kid is about as close to God as any mutant could possibly be. Now, of course, all that comes to a head with the iconic conclusion, and that does tie in to the larger narrative of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four. As always, we have covered this stuff, and I'll post links so you guys can check it out. But what happened in this story, as it pertained to adult Franklin Richards, is that Reed had joined the Council of Reeds, and the Council of Reeds were composed of different versions of Reed Richards across the multiverse who would essentially sacrifice their families in honor of a greater pursuit, solving the problem of everything. Well, one of these versions of Reed had traveled to an alternate reality where they encountered the Mad Celestials, and those Celestials had forced that entire reality to worship them as gods. And that when the Mad Celestials learned about the Council of Reeds, they realized this is a way into the greater multiverse. We can literally start conquering whole other universes. As a side here, this is probably what they did with Doctor Doom in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't know, just kind of throwing the idea out there, right? He took over a whole universe, learns about the multiverse from the Fantastic Four, and now he is looking to conquer everything. I don't know. The important thing is this, right? Focusing on Franklin. You guys know I love getting sidetracked here. Focusing on Franklin, what ends up happening is that Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel, who had long since abandoned him, had actually been traveling the entirety of the multiverse. And what he learned is that in every possible future of the main Marvel universe, Reed Richards is killed by the Mad Celestials. There's nothing he can ever do to overcome it. He builds Saul's anvil, right? This weapon that's capable of seemingly destroying Celestials. They bring in Galactus, the whole nine yards. Reed always dies. And Franklin figures that out as well. And so Franklin and Valeria from the future jump to the past at the right moment so that they can essentially, or at least Franklin, can absorb the powers of his younger self, with present-day Franklin realizing that he's been working with his future self the entire time, and that with their powers combined, Franklin Richards from the future resurrects Galactus from the dead, and then in turn, they defeat the Mad Celestials. What is also important to note here is that this is the second time that's happened in Marvel Comics. It's not the first time that Franklin's resurrected Galactus. In fact, that took place in the early 2000s with the Abraxas saga. And that was a story where Galactus had basically died, but had warned the Fantastic Four, with my death, something much worse is coming. And Abraxas was kind of the living embodiment of destruction across the multiverse. And that Abraxas started killing every version of Galactus across the multiverse that he could possibly find. Towards the ending of that story, Franklin had resurrected Galactus from the dead. Galactus took the ultimate nullifier, he wiped out Abraxas, and that was the end of the story. So again, it was Hickman building on a lot of those small little threads that came together for the character of Franklin. Now, truth to tell, for a lot of fans out there, this is kind of where the powers of Franklin Richards peaked, right? Just the most incredible displays of his abilities. Because even during Jonathan Hickman's run on Avengers and New Avengers, going into Secret Wars 2015, while Franklin Richards was a part of that story, he was not a major part of it, and none of his reality warping powers were really invoked by Jonathan Hickman. The only real exception to that is that Reed Richards had used the powers of Franklin to try to create like a new reality that everybody on Earth could go to in order to escape the incursions, but Franklin seemingly wasn't able to do it. There was a point where Captain America was time displaced, something like 50,000 years in the future or something along those lines, and he comes across Franklin Richards on this journey, and Franklin's very cryptic, right? He's like, you're not going to be able to stop the incursions and yada, yada, yada. And even during Secret Wars 2015, Franklin's there, but he just kind of hangs out with Galactus all the time. And that's it. They don't really do anything, right? So Franklin's involvement is very, very minuscule until you get to the end of Secret Wars. And the reason why is because one of the things Jonathan Hickman had established during his run in the Fantastic Four is that yes, Franklin Richards can alter reality and do all kinds of crazy stuff, but his real role within the universe is that he is a universal shaper. He can give it any shape he wants, alter it any way he wants. This was important because at the end of Secret Wars 2015, the Molecule Man Owen Reese served as the wellspring of power, that Reed Richards served as the memory of how the multiverse was supposed to look, and Franklin served as the way to shape it. And so with these three working together, Molecule Man would provide the bedrock for any particular universe, that Reed Richards would remember where its place is in the multiverse. Franklin would populate that universe with life and all kinds of stuff, and so then then Reed would take that universe and throw it out into the multiverse right back where it was supposed to be. So again, that was kind of the extent of Franklin's powers, because following that and going into the post-Secret Wars landscape, Franklin's been very spotty, and honestly, a lot of fans of Franklin have not been a huge fan of it. And the reason why, for example, is because during the Krakoan age, when the X-Men had their own island that they were residing on, there was a Fantastic Four X-Men crossover where Franklin was supposed to go to Krakoa. And while he didn't stay there full time because he was a member of the Fantastic Four and the Future Foundation, he would kind of go back and forth between the two. But then suddenly Marvel came along and said, actually, Franklin's not a mutant. Franklin wanted to be a mutant so bad that he had used his powers to alter his genetic structure to make it look like he was a mutant, but he wasn't. So he was barred from Krakoa. He could never go back. And then Marvel came back and said, actually, no, he was a mutant. He is a mutant. The thing is, he only uses his powers once a year. And the way he uses his powers is to monitor any crisis across the universe that would affect Earth. And he uses his powers to either stop that crisis from happening or to kind of guide events in such a way that whatever superheroes are going to be involved in that crisis end up coming out on top. The reality here, and this is an important thing to understand with Franklin, is that his power is incredible. It's wildly vast, and that makes him a MacGuffin. It's very hard to tell a compelling story with a character who can do virtually anything, right? When the current universe ends, in Marvel Comics, for example, Franklin Richards will merge with Galactus and they'll be reborn into a new universe as a being with incredible power, a composite of both Franklin and Galactus. When you have a character like that, virtually any problem can be solved easily. And so the current state of Franklin, which is that he only allows himself to use his reality warping powers once a year, is really the only way to have his character stick around in Marvel Comics without fans asking the question, well, why doesn't Franklin just snap his fingers and fix it? Like, why doesn't he just solve whatever the problem happens to be? Because that's the issue you would come into. The other thing that I want to talk about here is where Franklin sits in the hierarchy of things. Because again, this is something that kind of confuses people. Now, we have made a video on the Marvel power hierarchy, the current state that Marvel has it as the official power hierarchy, but there's also the unofficial hierarchy. And the difference between these two things is that, as you would expect, the official hierarchy is sanctioned by Marvel, created by Marvel. The unofficial hierarchy is the one that's essentially created by fans, and it actually contains a lot of characters that simply don't exist anymore, or have displayed levels of power that Marvel's simply ignoring for the purpose of being able to create their own hierarchy. And so in the official Marvel hierarchy, Franklin Richards is the most powerful mutant in Marvel Comics. Now, this hierarchy is determined using the inherent powers of that particular mutant, which is to say powers that they have on their own with no external force whatsoever. So again, by the very nature of this, Marvel is not including the cosmic control rod as the nature of Franklin's powers. But it's also why Franklin is considered more powerful than Jean Grey, for example, and the official Marvel hierarchy, because Jean Grey is a very powerful telepath and telekinetic, but it's the Phoenix Force that makes her a kind of multiversal, or at the very least, universal character. Without the Phoenix Force, she's just a really capable telepath and telekinetic. But Franklin doesn't have any caveats. There are no adjustments to his power from some external source. Now, the unofficial hierarchy puts the Marquis of Death as the number one guy, right? I mean, the Marquis of Death was hopping and skipping through entire universes, wiping them out with a wave of his hand, and would absolutely stomp Franklin Richards, and it wouldn't even be close, right? It wouldn't be any kind of a contest whatsoever. But again, the Marquis of Death was created and destroyed in a single storyline. He hasn't been seen or heard from since, and there's no reason to believe that he would be, right? Characters like Mad Jim Jaspers are comparable to Franklin Richards, but Franklin's more powerful than Jaspers. Even though Jaspers is more prodigious, he needs a reality to alter. Franklin does not. He can create something out of nothing. And so I say all this to say, your mileage may vary on which hierarchy you choose to go with, but hopefully this gives you guys a pretty solid, well-rounded understanding of what Franklin's capable of. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of every feat that he's achieved in Marvel Comics, but it should give you a pretty strong understanding. And so hopefully you carry this into the Fantastic Four and find yourself asking the question, just like I did, what happens when this kid is born? Woe betide the poor soul that pisses off that toddler, right? That takes candy away from him, because he's going to turn him into who knows what, lay waste to the entirety of the universe. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and hopefully it taught you everything you need to know. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.